Good evening. Tonight we start with something bright, something amazing. It changed how we saw matter itself. Radium. Forget the pretty glow you know. Forget the fancy bottles. Behind that shine were factories, fake cures, and a human cost the ads never told. Truth is you would not last a day in a radium workshop long ago. Handed one of those famous cures, the glow would feel less like hope and more like danger. If you like this, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where everyone is. Turn off your notifications, take a breath, and let us begin. In 1896, Henry Becquerel was not looking for a revolution. He was a careful scientist, following up on a curious idea. Months earlier, Röntgen found amazing X-rays. This shook up Europe. Paris of the century's end was full of labs. The new invisible rays could show bones and make shadows on film. This excited everyone, from academy halls to small cluttered rooms, where people still ground minerals for fun. Becquerel studied phosphorescent salts. These glow softly after light is gone. He asked a simple question. Could uranium salts glow like Röntgen's rays? He tried an experiment in a common way. He wrapped photo plates in black paper, put uranium crystals on top, and left it in a drawer by a window. He thought sunlight might cause a faint image, but one morning was cloudy. Sunlight did not do its job. Yet when he developed the plates, they were darkened, as if something passed through the paper. He first thought it was a mistake, a bad plate or stray light, but he tried again on dark days. He changed the conditions slowly. The same thing happened. Uranium with no sunlight, even covered in black paper, gave off energy that darkened the plate. It was a strange thing. The source was invisible. It went through paper. It acted like light, but was not light. It was like a ghost in the lab glassware. It could not be explained away. That small observation in Paris moved a solid pillar of 19th century science. Atoms were seen as stable little bricks, unchanging parts that made compounds. Energy came from reactions, not from inside an element itself. Becquerel's salts suggested otherwise. Whatever came from uranium was spontaneous. It kept going. It came from the element itself, not from surface tricks or outside light. In one confusing move, matter began to speak a new way. It could make its own light, and it could tell secrets to photo plates. News of Becquerel, less fine, spread fast, like an electric current through Europe's land. Röntgen's shock made people listen. Becquerel's salts gave them a new language. When the Curies turned to that language, they did so with stubborn care. They lived by measurement and chemical method. Mariska Curie came to Paris from Warsaw. She knew math and physics, and had an outsider's clear vision. Pierre Curie was known for work on crystals. He was a gentle and patient partner. Together they had a lab, not shiny with marble, but with cracked tiles and bare benches, more a shed than a shrine. They read Becquerel with a chemist's hunger. If uranium salts fogged plates, which substances did the most work? They found something fast and unsettling. Pitchblende, a heavy black ore, was much more active than pure uranium. Pitchblende came from Joachim's Thal in Bohemia. The grains and residues arrived as dark piles, waste from mining other metals. The Curies found this waste had strong emissions, stronger than its uranium content could explain. There was more than uranium at work. If pitchblende was more active than uranium alone, then a simple lab calculation followed. Other elements must be present, elements whose energies came out in Becquerel a less strange way. The work that followed needed patience. It needed method and endurance. Marie and Pierre began separating, purifying and weighing, then separating, purifying and weighing again. The chemical techniques were old in style, but modern in use. They crushed ore to powder, dissolved dust in strong acids, until residues gave up secrets. They precipitated salts. They used fractional crystallization to use tiny differences in solubility. They repeated these cycles so many times, fatigue could not describe it. They used classic reactions to remove iron, to separate barium from its chemical family. Radium S chemistry is close to barium S. Studying tiny differences in solubility was how they coaxed out trace amounts. The scale of their work matters. It turns discovery romance into sober logistics. Pitchblende does not give freely. To get a whisper of a new element, needed tons and tons of ore. Popular images show to glowing figures in a small lab. They miss the freight wagons, the smoldering acid jars, the nights lit by electric light, the white mortars that ground minerals to dust. Marie and Pierre wrote about residues they bought, and the trouble of transport and storage. They ordered chemicals with the thrift of the poor. It is easy now to think of inspiration as a flair. The reality is many mornings. The Curies put aside impatience and returned to the same precipitate, the same bottle, the same glass jewels. Their wins were the compound rewards of repetition. In 1898 they grew bold. They announced a new radioactive substance, or renamed it polonium for Poland, later the more famous radium, a name Marie chose for the strength of its rays. From the Latin word for ray, polonium was a sentimental name, radium was a scientific brand. Both names carried the couple's identity, Marie's roots and a description of the thing itself. Naming was not vanity. It was a way to claim a fact. What made the salt special was not surface chemistry or light whim, but a court rate of the atoms themselves. They did not find radium in crystal glory on a bench. They found it as a subtle, stubborn enrichment. The first time they isolated a tiny amount of radium chloride, a small gleaming salt. They were amazed such a delicate thing came from so much dirt. By some accounts, by 1902, they had prepared a gram or so, a small but real sample. After processing many tons of pitchblende waste, those numbers matter, tons to grams to milligrams. They turned science marvel into human and financial terms. Getting a miracle was first a question of freight rates, of glassware supply, of small grants and friendly loans. They were not indifferent to money. They had little. What they had was patience. That work was not just physical. It reshaped method. Before the Curie's radioactivity was an oddity, a curious fog on a plate. By measuring how electroscopes discharged, by quantifying how photoemulsion darkened, the Curies turned an observation into a property, something labs could compare. Marie coined the word radioactivity. Her term did two jobs at once. It gave the thing a name, and said it should be treated like any other quantity, something to measure, record, and reason about. European scientists, used to qualitative curiosities, now had to learn patience with this new property. As they learned, the details grew. The instrument started humble and grew subtle. A simple gold leaf electrospoke showed. Something from uranium salt could discharge gold foil. The discharge rate was a crude measure of strength. Photo plates were proof then used for comparison. Pierre Curie's skill with sensitive measurement pushed the couple to refine the apparatus. They used electrometers to measure tiny currents from ionization near a sample. They recorded discharge rates under shielding. The apparatus was simple and elegant. They turned a qualitative wonder into numbers. The next generation of instruments moved further. Ernest Rutherford brought a craftsman's eye. If these emissions were real, were they all the same? Using magnetic and electric fields, Rutherford and others found at least two classes of rays. They named them alpha and beta. Alpha rays bent only slightly. They acted like they had a positive charge and mass. Beta rays turned easily, as if negative and tiny. Then, in 1900, Paul Villard, a French chemist studying radium, found evidence of a more penetrating emission, one that passed through thick lead and was barely affected by magnetic fields. It was named gamma. For a brief awkward moment in science, these rays joined a family album, their personalities just being understood. Detecting these personalities needed more than one trick. When Rutherford wanted to count alpha particles, he used a scintillating screen, a thin coat of zinc sulfide. When struck by an alpha particle, it flashed briefly. The observer sat in a dark room, counting flashes under a magnifying glass, tallying particles per unit time. The method relied on the human eye, yet it was precise. It allowed counting of single events. On other benches, ionization chambers measured tiny currents from ionized air. Electrometers turned those currents into numbers comparable across seasons and nations. The conceptual seam opened by these tools was deep. Becquerel found an emission. Rutherford and others saw the emission meant different things, with different material results. Alpha particles within a decade were shown to be helium nuclei, to protons and to neutrons, heavy positive kernels that could become helium atoms. Beta rays were identified with the electron. The tiny negative particle J.J. Thomson confirmed. Gamma rays, the most penetrating, were understood as electromagnetic radiation, with wavelengths shorter than X-rays. The same kind of phenomenon, but from a fiercer source. The atom was not a single simple particle. It was a little city of parts that could be rearranged and ejected. With that came a new theory of change. Frederick Soddy, working with Rutherford, formalized the idea that radioactive substances undergo spontaneous transmutation. One element decays into another, sometimes through a chain of steps. The process follows statistical regularities. Half-life, the time for half the atoms to disintegrate, became a central idea. It let small bench measurements predict lifespans, and how a sample would act in medicine or industry. The math of decay's import exponential laws gave physicists a firm grip on what seemed capricious. If some elements lasted and others quickly turned into daughters with different chemistries, these patterns could be mapped. Instruments could measure the maps with steadily better resolution. Alongside classifying particles came a slow growth of language and standards. People needed ways to say clearly how radioactive a sample was. Marie and Pierre Curie by the measurements, and their public standing afterward, like the Nobel Prize in 1903, gave their names to a scale and a scientific habit. The unit Curie came to be a benchmark, first defined by a gram of radium activity, later fixed as about 3.7 times 10 to the 10 disintegrations per second, a human scale unit from a human scale discovery. Much later, the Becquerel was adopted in the international system as 1 disintegration per second. That name paid direct homage to Becquerel, the less first patient night. But in those years, scientific language was made in labs. Radioactivity for the phenomenon, radium for the element, polonium for the offshoot named for a homeland. Those syllables were tools. They let conversations cross borders in ways brass plates and badges could not. The instruments changed the social economy of science, where chemistry once worked by mixing and isolating. For smell, color, and weight, radioactivity needed capital secrecy and numbers. To build us into daily encounter, or fund ship freight for tons of pitchblende, needed more than curiosity. It needed money, sponsors, and institutional support. Governments and hospitals watched with practical interest as these new rays showed power to read and skin, to shrink tissue, to darken photo emulsion, and in controlled doses to shrink tumors. The idea that matter could radiate enough energy to have a clinical effect turned speculation into demand. Radium extracted with weary precision in Parisian labs did not stay at chemists' wonder for long. Within a decade, it had a market, and with a market came new questions of supply, regulation, and heroism in the form of costly institutes and endowed chairs. At the level of pure thought, radioactivity forced physicists to rewrite the atom. The 19th century's images were molecular and mechanical. The 20th began with atoms that held their own energy and could change themselves. Planck's quantum hypothesis of 1900 and Einstein's work on the photoelectric effect in 1905 fit poorly with classical continuous energy theories. Radioactivity needed new instruments and a new willingness to accept that nature kept reserves of behavior that were probabilistic and internal, not just from collisions and outside influences. Rutherford's work, especially after he returned to England, and the scattering experiments that led to the 1911 nuclear model of the atom, gave shape to the idea that a concentrated nucleus set at the atom's heart, and the forces binding it could under certain conditions break and rearrange. The atom was now a small machine with moving parts. This was a revolution disguised as patient calibration. The same labs that once measured boiling point now measured alpha particle ranges in air, the angles rays bent in magnetic fields, and currents from ionization. The results were not just murmurs about matter's mutability. They were data points that allowed mapping and prediction. Where Becquerel put a uranium crystal on a plate, the post-Curie, post-Rutherford community designed experiments with shields and apertures, with magnetic fields measured to the centimeter, and electrometers that recorded currents too faint to hear. Physics ceased to be only a way of seeing. It became a way of telling others precisely what was seen. That practice of precision turned radioactivity into something usable. It is tempting to linger on the romance of discovery, the glowing salts on a dark bench, the exhausted joy of finding a new element, the applause at the Academy for a paper read aloud. But beneath those moments is another story, less glamorous but more decisive, the story of logistics and persuasion. To turn radium from a curiosity into a tool needed movement of ore from Bohemia to Paris, of glassware and acid from local suppliers to a drafty lay, and of ideas from physicists' notebooks to hospital operating room. It needed skeptics converted, measurements standardized, instruments improved, so too men in different cities could say with math confidence they measured the same thing. This was achieved slowly with more patience than we believe, and with comic amounts of paperwork and shipping barter. There is a small royal irony in how the invisible became through invention so suddenly and insistently present. Instruments made to reveal a ghostly emission began to make entities that could be counted and catalogued. A single alpha particle, once an abstract notion, became a click of flash on ink sulfide or a tick on a counter. Ionization currents, once whisper, became the basis for measuring half-lives and comparing samples across borders. Language hardened into units. Radium, named for the ray, became an economic commodity, its price absurdly high. It scarcely shaped early 20th century science as much as any lab romance. So from Becquerel, the less darkened plates in 1896, to the Curie's long campaign of chemical attrition, to Rutherford and Villa des analytic pruning, into alpha, beta and gamma, the story of radium and its kin is both the story of discovery and the story of slow human habits that turn curiosity into knowledge. It is a tale of small rooms and great patience, of freight contracts and the geometry of magnetic fields, of men and women who could sit long enough with instruments to let the atom grow articulate. In the quiet after those years of patient work, consequences began to appear. Medicine felt the pull of possibility. Radium, with its persistent emission and its power to destroy tissue locally, suggested therapies called miraculous in that age. Chemistry had to accept elements could be fleeting labels, that one element could yield to another, like chapters in a long unchangeable book. Physics had to remake the atom into a structure with internal life. And the instruments, electroscopes, scintillating screens, electrometers, ionization chambers and later cloud chambers and counters, stitched labs across nations into a new collaborative practice. The discovery that began as a photo mystery became within a decade the seed of a new discipline. Radioactivity, a subject that married chemistry, physics and medicine to yield both knowledge and power. There is poignancy that something so slow and merrick could unleash such quick imaginations. The first story is not of instant triumph, but of drawn-out work. of valves and beakers, of grinding on chemical separations that feel almost art isn't up close. Yet that patient arithmetic, the counting of flashes, the weighing of precipitates, the endless fractional crystallization, had an eventual ferocity in its consequences. In a few years it turned a lab oddity into a force that would pull at economies, at hospital wards, and at the very structure of atomic theory. The glow that frightened no one when first seen on a bench would in decades to come become one of the most consequential lights of the 20th century. For the moment the tale belongs to the patient few, Becquerel in his quiet study, the Curies in their drafty shed, counting and counting again, and the first instruments that taught humanity to listen to matter's once silent complaint. Almost at once radium was embraced as a healer, the new mineral isolated by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, still smelling of the lab and the rare earth, arrived in hospitals with ritual gravity, wrapped in lead kept in vaults, entrusted to surgeons and scanned doctors, who spoke of it with hope and experimental courage. Within a few years doctors in Paris, Vienna, London, Berlin, New York and Boston were putting small sealed sources into cavities in flesh, mixing physics, metallurgy, craft and a doctor's instinct. They called some practices Curie therapy, a name that dignified the remedy by linking to the Curie name. Others preferred the older Greek-rooted word that endured, brachytherapy, short-distance therapy, for the method's close touch with the tumor it aimed to destroy. The tools were at first crude and elegant together. Radium needles, platinum, or gold tubes filled with radium salts, sealed tight. Tiny glass tubes, sometimes in metal, that could be held with forceps and slipped into an organ or set in tissue. Capsule sources that released an emanation radon when heated, and later standardized sealed sources of radium-226, whose activity could be measured against a common standard. Doctors learned to handle these objects with ceremonial care. Lead-lined chests for storage, thick gloves, tongues that extended the hand's reach and removed human warmth from the treatment. That care mattered in more ways than one. Radium's value, both money and symbolic, was huge. A single gram of radium could cost 5 figures in dollars. One gesture of early 20th century medical giving was fundraising to let a hospital buy even a few milligrams. The American gift of a gram of radium to Marie Curie, raised by women's groups costing about $100,000, became legend as an emblem of high priesthood. Clinical practice raced ahead of symmetry. Early reports were case studies. A tumor shrank lesions, often the patient once hopeless had time. In Paris, skin doctors like Henry Alexandre Anlos tried radium on lupus and stubborn skin conditions. As early as the century's first years, gynecologists, seeing the cervix and uterus as suited for local therapy, began putting radium capsules into the vaginal and uterine space. In Vienna, Guido Hall's nectar radiologist kept careful records and pushed for exposure measurement methods. Long before anyone spoke the language of regulated doses, in New York and Boston, surgeons like Robert Abbey embraced radium as an aid to the knife. Abbey, a visible figure in American surgery, published accounts of successful treatment and lobbied for clinical adoption. By the 1910s, the technique called brachytherapy, a system of placing a radioactives or close to or inside a tumor, had followers on departments, textbooks and curricula. A body of technical law that mixed the bedside, the bench and the workshop. Technology shaped practice. A radium seed might be 1/8 of a milligram, or a story in itself. Tiny metal cylinders holding precious glowing dust. Platinum capillaries filled and sealed by glass workers who learned to work with new materials like fine jewelry. For inside the body treatment, doctors made applicators and gauged exposure times in hours and days, leaving the seeds in place carefully, because strength fell with distance and time. Removal too early meant failure. Leave them too long and the patients suffered. The Curie aimed for Marie and Pierre Curie, roughly the activity of 1 gram of radium, became a unit of measurement, a common language between physicist and physician. But for a long time the language was only approximate. Radiologists measured exposure by placement and hours, by a clinic's willingness to keep a source in place, and a surgeon's confidence the application could be repeated. It was improvisation framed as serious medicine. The improvisers included not just doctors, but also machinists, watchmakers, and glass blowers. The institutional response was fast. Radium Institute special centers, mixing research and clinical service, opened across Europe and North America. Marie Curie herself turned public attention into institutional form. The Institute Radium in Paris grew around her lab, and the clinical needs radiotherapy demanded. It became a magnet for doctors who wanted radium for patients, and physicists who wanted to measure it. The Curie Foundation, set up in the early 1920s, formalized the marriage of research and treatment, and helped professionalize radium therapy. The Curie name carried weight. That weight became trust for patients and funding for hospitals. In Poland, Curie's home country, a Radium Institute was founded in Warsaw in the 1920s, a result of national pride and transnational generosity that made radium accessible far from Paris. These institutions, with their vaults and operating theaters, clinics and lecture halls, became beacons for doctors keen to learn and to earn the right to use radium in their own practices. So the line between real therapeutic innovation and therapeutic overreach was drawn and redrawn in the wards. On one side, careful evidence-seeking doctors who did repeated treatments, recorded responses, and tried to quantify what they did. On the other, practitioners and business people who mistook stories for proof, who sold radium as a cure for almost anything, and who fed off public fascination. The aura of medical authority was strong. A doctor in a white coat, a clinic letterhead, a published case series in a respected journal. These were signs radium had passed some threshold of acceptability. Yet the same symbols were used by hustlers. Doctors advertised radium treatments with the same tools they used to sell their skill. Photos of smiling patients, testimonials, the use of Curie units in ads to signal scientific seriousness. It was easy to confuse the weight of the apparatus, the lead boxes, the metal needles, the seal of approval, with clinical certainty. It was also easy for well-meaning doctors, given fast, promising case reports, to push the bounds of use, to try radium on tough infections, on chronic rheumatism, on cosmetic marks. The temptation to treat everything with the new glow was a medical story as old as Hippocrates. A new till a new hope rushed to apply. Business followed the glow, while clinics and institutes bore the high cost of radium and the training to use it. Business people outside medicines bore a more inviting market. The consumer, they seized the same aura that legitimized radium in surgery and repackaged it for the parlor, the vanity table, the spa, the pocket. Spas in Central Europe, places already trading in mineral waters and reputation, began to stress the presence of radium and other radioactive parts in their springs. Towns like Bad Gastein in the Austrian Alps and the famous Carlsbad Calaviveri in Bohemia had long histories of healing and high society. By the early 20th century they advertised not just minerals and baths, but the invisible, supposedly invigorating emanations from below. A steam room in a spa became an ad and postcards, a place where modern physics met traditional therapy. Light filtered through lace curtains. The water smelled faintly of iron and earth. Labels said ride and rich waters for body rejuvenation. For the well-off a stay, a touch of place was a weekend, and proof of modern taste. In the United States the market took a different, more extractive hue, where European spas used natural springs. American patent medicine makers bottled the miracle. William J. A. Bailey, a man with a grand title and prerogatives, marketed Roddy for a clear bottled radium water. He said it restored vigor and health. The product was simple in concept and bold in marketing. A measured dose of dissolved radium salts in a sweet, drinkable solution. sold to the public with testimonials. Testimonials that read like modern influencer endorsements. One of Roddy Thur's most famous users was Eben Byers, a rich American former amateur sportsman who drank large amounts on Bailey's advice for years. Byers' death in 1930 to turn the story into a national scandal. The press loved the image of a once strong man, reduced by a consumer product that promised youth. The government response was not instant, but inevitable. Newspapers demanded inquiries. Scientists demanded evidence. Regulators slow to move, but now with a high-profile case, tightened scrutiny. The Roddy Thur affair shows sharply how commercial appetite and scientific mystique could combine, how a mineral truly useful in some clinical setting could be changed into a consumable and slide into quackery. The marketing playbook for Radiant products was familiar and effective. Novelty, the language of science, celebrity and scarcity. Ads showed bottles with elegant labels, doctors' credentials in small print, and glamorous women, often actresses and singers, whose endorsements adjusted a small sip or cream would restore beauty and calm. Patent medicines with radium promised everything, from virility to digestive aid. Cosmetics claimed to refine the skin's natural glow with the help of radioactivity. Even the scarcity of radium at cost, and the difficulty of getting it from pitch blende in Bohemia and elsewhere, became a value signal. A product with real radium cost more, and that higher price was presented as a guarantee of authenticity. Business people stretched supply by putting tiny, almost unmeasurable amounts into tonics, creams and elixirs, creating many products from small amounts of the element. The economic incentives were too strong to resist. A little radium spread across thousands of small bottles meant very large profits. Regulation lagged behind taste and thirst. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States gave some framework against fraud, but the science of radioactivity and the public's hunger for modern cures outpaced enforcement. Luxury spas and the new cult of modern health fed each other. Wealthy patrons paid high fees for weekend cures. Health resorts offered radium inhalations or radioactive baths, where owners measured the gas content of the water and promised relief from common middle-age ailments. Travel logs described the experience in hushed, approving tones. The mild warmth of the baths, the conviviality of afternoon tea, idle talk about the benefits of the latest treatment. For many patrons, the appeal was partly medical, partly social. A stay at a Radium spa was a sign of being in step with modern science and luxury. Countries like Austria and Germany found a good income stream in these destinations. Towns with radon-rich geology marketed themselves to an international clientele. The steam and mineral smell of the springs became part of the tourism economy. The gap between promise and proof widened as the 20s roared on. Scientific medicine was consolidating. Clinical trials began to take more formal shape in some places. Yet consumer radium products thrived because they sold a story, not an outcome. The story was persuasive. Modern science was making the invisible visible, and so the invisible could be controlled. By the late 20s and into the 1930s, the mix of celebrity, advertising and lack of clear rules produced scandals that invited scrutiny. Eben Byers' death, more than anything, crystallized the media and government response. Photos of his ruined jaw and public testimony about his consumption made sensational headlines, and the American public finally faced the limits of the radium fad. The Food and Drug Administration and state health departments began to apply pressure. Lawsuits followed, and slowly the consumer market, so dependent on trust and spectacle, shrank. The era of branded radium waters and tonic cure-alls was ending, not by one law but by a series of exposures, investigations, and a growing professional consensus that electromagnetic brilliance was not always health. While patent medicine and Spock culture collapsed into scandal and rules, radium's other marriage to material modernity continued. less visibly but more lastingly. The element's glowing properties, first noticed by chemists and watchmakers, became a technological vocabulary of convenience. Paint makers mixed radium salts with a phosphor, usually zinc sulfide, and made a paint that glowed in the dark with a cool green light. Not bright, not blinding, but enough to read at aisle at night. The adoption was almost instant where the need was practical. Soldiers in First World War trenches, sailors on dark decks, aviators starting to fly at night, all needed instruments they could check without a lamp. Companies in the United States and Switzerland, Hamilton in Lancaster Gulch in Illinois, Waltham and many others, and clusters of makers around Loch was de Fonsbean in Geneva, ordered luminous dials in huge numbers. War economies sped up demand. Military contracts created scale. The radium luminous industry became both commercial and strategic. Painting a watch dial needed small, steady hands. Craftspeople who could paint numerals, gears and hands with a brush as fine as a hair. The process was art even as it was industrial. Little shops employing mostly women, whose nimble fingers traced tiny strokes of luminous paint across porcelain and metal. The paint itself was a peculiar alchemy, a fine phosphor mixed with a measured amount of radium salt, mixed to a consistency that flowed from a sable brush without blotting. Factories ordered radium from chemical suppliers, who got it from pitchblende or in places like Joachimsthal in Bohemia, and later from deposits farther off. The raw element was refined in smelters and labs, weighed, certified and sent in secure containers. Companies like the United States Radium Corporation in New Jersey grew as suppliers of luminous materials. Their names became known to watchmakers and instrument makers, and later to investigators. Those small shops and luminous factories fit easily into the talk of modernity. Their products were essential to daily life. Watches you could read at night, luminous dials for aircraft and naval instruments, emergency signs that would guide you in blackouts. But they depended on a material whose handling needed new safety, and whose dangers were not yet fully understood. Night became an ally of progress. Pilots flying at dusk relied on faintly glowing altimeters. Sailors kept radium-lit compasses in their pockets. Luminous signs in buildings and transit hubs promised safety in outages. Cities gained an odd soft green glow of convenience. Scattered in pockets and on wrists of citizens, the glow comforted. It also hid the labor and materials that made it. The growth of this industry was again a story of scale and logistics. Makers built contracts with mining concerns and refineries to secure regular shipments of radium-bearing salts. They set up workshops near watchmaking hubs to cut transit of finished dials. They made small quality control routines to ensure the paint's long-term brightness. Governments, especially after trench warfare in 1914-18, saw the strategic value in domestic production of luminous devices and were willing to buy in bulk. Military orders where urgent came before civilian ones. Navies wanted compasses, signaling devices and emergency markers. Armies wanted watches, medical instruments and radio gear that could be used at night. The market responded by expanding output and by standardizing some parts of production. Yet standardization in those years meant little for worker safety. The priority was output, and the technical problem of making paint that glowed for years. Radium's presence in daily life felt too many like a benign part of modernity. Convenience, safety, and a certain stylish chic. Fashionable watches glowed in a dark ballroom. A soldier checked his luminous dial by gunfire spark light. A spa guest returned home rejuvenated, with a vague mystique that included ride-on inhalation, and a few bottles of a tonic whose label read like a lab note. There was irony in that mix. The same element that saved and measured might also be sold in patent medicines and painted on jewelry. The social energy around radium was polyvalent. Philanthropic in one hand, commercial in another, scientific in a third. The glow sometimes hid in anxiety, about how to control a force whose physics were just being tamed by measurement, and whose clinical margins were still being set by trial, error and slow data. By the end of the interwar years, the scenes of that early romance showed. Scandals closed some paths. Wars redirected production into military channels, and the new disciplines of radiology and radiotherapy pushed for clearer standards. Yet the mark radium left on the modern landscape was deep. In hospitals, brachytherapy had become a real discipline, with techniques and training programs. In commerce, the radium craze had shown both the appetite for modern cures and the moral dangers of unregulated science. And in daily life, the soft, steady glow of luminous dials and instruments had embedded radioactivity into modern convenience. It remained in those years an emblem of a world that trusted the lab to remake bodies and things, an emblem that mixed a scientist's notebook with a merchant's brochure. The miracle and the mania had been braided together, with clinics and spas, chemists and watchmakers, philanthropists and business people all playing parts. The question that began to whisper through labs, courtrooms and kitchens was not just whether radium could cure or glow, but what it should be allowed to touch. The first radium economies were not made by physicists in quiet labs, but by men and women sweating in dark places, where rocks hide their secret light. Radium is a shy thing, a child of uranium and thorium, born in tiny amounts inside heavy mineral pitchblende urine in it, then hidden again in the mud waste of mines. To find a speck of it, a company had to move mountains. Tons of pitchblende work rushed, dissolved in acids, precipitated, precipitated, washed and heated. And through all these chemical rituals, the faint glimmer of a new market was coaxed into being. The Curious Lab triumph of 1898, the alchemy that named and isolated radium, was followed by a very practical, very noisy procession of carts, rail cars and steamships, carrying dark ore from Central Europe, and later from the tropics and the far north, to refineries that could turn geology into medicine, paint and money. At the start of the 20th century, the map of radium was small and odd. Joachimsthal, known in German as St. Joachimsthal, a silver mining town tucked into the ore mountains of Bohemia, had been worked for centuries, and yielded in the late 19th century pockets of pitchblende, rich enough to matter. Pierre and Marie Curie got samples from that region. Their extraction work began the modern trade in radium-bearing ore. As demand for radium for therapy, for luminous paint, for the prestige of labs grew, miners in Saxony, in the French Massif Central, and in scattered outcrops across Europe and North America, supplied it in modest amounts. The ore was heavy, the work hard, and for those who handled it, profit lay mainly with the refiners. New veins were found under far stranger skies. In 1915, a remote deposit in what was then the Belgian Congo, at Shinkolobwe in Katanga, revealed itself as a geological treasure of a different order, or that held not just traces but concentrations that made industrial extraction profitable with modern methods. Union Mine, Air du Haut Katanga, the big Belgian colonial mining company, took control. Later in 1930, Gilbert Lobb, a Canadian prospector, walked the shores of Great Bear Lake and found what would become Port Radium, a northern outcrop whose ore would carry its own story into the mid-20th century. Suddenly the geography of supply had spread. The sleepy towns of Bohemia were joined by colonial mines in Africa and by outcrops in Beryl, Canada. Each site brought its own logistics. Roads cut into permafrosts, river barges twisting through tropical forest, railheads pushing toward ports. Radium-S rarity-shaped strategy. The element was not something you dug up and sold by the ton. It was an ingredient that needed value-added handling, that made refinement, measurement and safe handling as important as finding the ore. For many years, a kilogram of ore might yield only the smallest fraction of a gram of radium. That meant shipping raw material long distances to central chemical plants that had the skill and patience to do what the Curies had done by hand in the Sorbonne, but at industrial scale. Antwerp became a hub for Congolese ore shipments. Shipping manifests and colonial accounting turned the mineral into a commodity, whose price responded fast to scarcity and rumor of new deposits. Canada's northern finds meant freight by barge and train to Lake Port Hope and other processing centers, where chemical engineers set up vats of sulfuric acid and long rows of settling tanks. Where the ore was rich enough, refining could happen near the mine. Where it was not, ore was mixed in consignments and sold to whoever would pay enough for recovery costs. The economic math of the 1910s and 20s, the era when radium stopped being just a lab curiosity and became a marketable substance, was brutal in its simplicity. Whoever controlled the mine and the means of refinement controlled access to the globe. Labs and hospitals paid exceptional sums. Nations weighed buying tiny amounts as a matter of prestige and policy. In 1921, a moment crystallized this fact in public memory. Marie Curie, who had given herself to the element and to therapy, traveled to the United States and was given a gram of radium, a gift collected by American owners and presented with ceremony. The gift was less a scientific need than an emblem. Radium was expensive enough and socially valuable enough that a nation's benefactors could lay a literal gram at a scientist's feet. For a time, radium was a diplomatic token. Those tokens were exchanged along trade routes that stitched colonial extraction to northern refineries and to the specialized workshops of Western Europe and America. Union, many Eros trains ran or two docks in Katanga. Canadian freighters moved cargo from Port Radium south to Montreal and Toronto. Chemical companies in England, France, Germany, and the United States got consignments, measured activity in the lab, and put radium salts into flasks and bottles. Refiners made standards because the market demanded them. Measurement matters when you sell something in microcuries. The National Bureau of Standards in Washington began to calibrate and certify radium samples. Hospitals and radiotherapy centers needed known activity to dose patients. There was logistical elegance in the system. Mines concentrated heavy raw material, refineries concentrated radiant matter, and labs concentrated knowledge. But concentrated wealth has a shadow. The human story of extraction is not just geology and freight. It is also labor and the rough math of cost. In the Belgian Congo, open pit and shaft mines were worked by colonial labor systems that favored profit and ignored long-term health and environmental costs borne by Africans. The Union Mini-Air complex was efficient by any 19th century standard. It was also extractive in the social sense, paying low wages, imposing quotas, and managing disease, malaria, typhus. The usual list of colonial harms, as if they were incidental to mineral production. In Canada, the find at Port Radium brought frontier modernity to the Dean and other indigenous communities around Great Bear Lake. Jobs came, and so did strict company control over the workplace, the company store, the seasonal rhythms of employment. Men and women worked underground in rock, dust, and damp air. In the dark, they scratched at seams whose reward was rich but rare. The geochemistry itself imposed costs that would be borne not just by miners but by whole landscape. Pitchblende does not give up its secrets cleanly. The process of getting radium and uranium yields waste that keeps radioactivity, that leaks radon gas, and that leaches heavy metals into waterways. Early refineries and mines had few ideas about waste containment. At Port Hope, Ontario, decades of refining left residue later generations had to clean up. In the Congo, waste in the scars where men dug pits stayed a hazard on the land, and to people living near the mines. Underground miners breathed radium with every breath. Their lungs years later would pay the price. Those aftershocks of extraction were quiet at first. They crept into lifetime stats, and into the stories of families whose breadwinners got sick. The market for radium widened and deepened in ways the Curies could not have foreseen. The glow found ordinary use on watch dials and instrument faces, in ship compasses and aircraft instruments, places where the faint green of radium-laden paint made a practical difference. That market created an unexpected and intimate production ecology. Paint is bent over dials around the clock, faces painted by small nimble hands. Watchmakers and instrument companies hired women and girls for the delicate work. Luminous paint, a mix of radium salts with a phosphor like zinc sulfide, set in small pots thick and ready. The final touch needed steady hands and fine points. The shorthand of manufacturing taught generations of dial painters an odd technique lip pointing to shape a brush to a fine tip. The worker would moisten it and form the bristles with a fingertip, sometimes bringing the brush to her mouth. The act was small and efficient. It also began in hundreds of workshops across the United States and Europe. An invisible contamination. The luminous compound felt almost magical in those early days. A faint green gleamed when lights went out. In wartime it was useful for watches and instruments. In peace it was fashionable on watch faces and in children's toys. And alongside real uses, the market for radioactive products included frauds and hustlers. Patent medicines with radium promised health, vitality, fertility. One of the most notorious of these quack elixirs was Radium, sold in the United States in the 20s and early 30s by William J. A. Bailey. Radium was bottled radioactivity sold with smiling confidence that the glow could cure. When the rich steel magnate Eben Byers died publicly in 1932 after drinking the product, his case became a wake-up moment for a public that had been gently amused and now felt betrayed. Radium's ads and ads for similar compounds spoke to a culture eager for miracle cures and to the extraordinary commodity value that let a bottle of glowing lotion equal a doctor's income. The regular unseen poisoning of luminous dial painters was not as sensational at first. Painters complained of aching jaws to floss, constant tiredness, small lesions in bone and gum. Doctors called osteosclerosis, or less kindly radium jaw. Over time the pattern became undeniable. The industry's most infamous piece unfolded in New Jersey, at the U.S. Radium Corporation factory in Orange, and in similar plants in Ottawa, Illinois and Waterbury, Connecticut. Young women who had painted dials for years began to die from what looked like grotesque infections of the jaw and skeleton. They were not dying in the heroic way medicine had advertised. They were dying of something ordinary and industrial. Here the arc of the radium story moved from chemistry and commerce into courtrooms and lab, and the two worlds, the practical economy of luminous dials and the abstract work of physicists, collided. The doctors who cared for the sick could see the pattern, but not the mechanism. The refiners and makers defended their practices with the language of normalcy and the authority of profit. The legal fights began when a handful of women, led in one famous case by Grace Fryer, decided to sue U.S. Radium Corporation in 1927. They were not the first or last to sue, but their claim crystallized a question with legal and scientific sides. Could a worker prove that chronic low-level ingestion of radium in a factory caused the bone lesions and cancer she now had? Proving cause would be the work of pathologists and physicists. In the mid-20s, the key technique was bone autopsy and radioactivity counting. Harrison Martland, a county medical examiner in Newark, and a quietly relentless investigator, played a central part. Martland could show that when a victim's bone was tested, it held measurable radium activity, that the elements spread in the skeleton explained why the jaw, so often a site of trauma from chewing and exposure, was a frequent spot for necrosis, that radium-mystic alpha particles emitted at close range could deposit energy in bone tissue and cause the kinds of lesions and tumors doctors were seeing. Martland's reports in the mid-20s. He gave papers and testified in trials, turned arcane radioactivity counts into narrative medicine. Here is the poison, here is where it lodges, here are the bodily consequences. Scientists were not unanimous at first. The era's analytical tools were less refined than later ones. Sample contamination measurement error and the difficulty of comparing individuals' exposure histories made the science debatable. Companies used that scientific uncertainty in court. US Radium hired doctors and chemists who suggested the illnesses could be from syphilis, poor nutrition, dental infection, oddity, anything but workplace radium. It was a familiar defense. Create reasonable doubt about cause, and make the plaintiff's burden of proof seem like a geological impossibility. The smallness of radium mass amounts helped the company rhetorically. How could something so scarce have such terrible effect? The press had a different role. Reporters moved between labs and courtrooms, and with a tone mixing sympathy and righteous anger, told the stories of women young when they entered the plants, and old in body before their time. Coverage in city newspapers turned private misery into public outrage. The image of young women bent over dials, smiling for factory photos as they worked, was a damning contrast to later pictures of the same workers. Their jaws missing teeth, their faces changed like chronic disease. Journalists did not just describe. They helped create a story that reduced corporate obfuscation to a moral question of responsibility. That public attention mattered in court because it changed the balance. Juries and judges who are human responded to more than expert testimony. Legally, the cases were knotty. The girls had to find lawyers willing to oppose powerful industrial interests. They had to beat doctrines like assumption of risk, which historically limited worker remedies by suggesting a person who took a job accepted its hazards. The newness of radiation as a hazard complicated this. Was this a risk known or knowable to the workers? The companies pleaded ignorance, or even invoked the glamour of science as defense. But the plaintiff's lawyers brought Martland's evidence and testimony from other industrial doctors, and the case told juries the hazards were not mystical, but foreseeable once the science was looked at honestly. Outcomes were mixed and, in the short term, unsatisfying. After long litigation and stubborn public attention, US Radium settled with several plaintiffs in 1928. Settlements acknowledged without admitting legal liability, in a broad sense, that the company would pay sums for medical care and the women's losses. Those settlements echoed across the industry. Some companies quietly changed their method. Lip pointing was banned in factory handbooks. Painting moved to better ventilated rooms. Storage of radium compounds became more regulated. These practical changes mattered. They cut a particular exposure path. But neither settlements nor memos could erase the larger truth that whole classes of workers had paid with their bodies for a market's appetite. The legal battles set precedents beyond the immediate settlements. For the first time in many courts were willing to accept disease that appeared after long low-level exposure as grounds for industrial negligence. That shift the slow recognition that occupational disease could be compensable, and that employers had a duty to anticipate and limit invisible hazards, would become part of 20th century labor law. It is easy now to say these were inevitable steps in an industrial society. At the time, they were the result of stubborn human beings, insisting science be heard in a legal context. Science itself responded. The pattern of injury in luminous dial plants made occupational medicine take radioactivity seriously. The International Alex Ryan Radium Protection Committee, the first international body to consider radiological safety in a coordinated way, was set up in 1928. It came from professional conferences where radiologists, physicists, and public health officials faced the fact that ionizing radiation once used without thought needed rules. Early recommendations were hesitant and conservative. They spoke of minimizing exposure, using shielding where possible, and monitoring radioactivity amounts in consumer devices and workplaces. National agencies, the U.S. Public Health Service among them, began to collect cases and issue guidance. The older view that saw radium as purely beneficial started to be replaced by the language of risk management. Public policy changed slower because the modern state itself was just beginning to weave health surveillance into employment law. Some state labor departments adapted factory inspection regimes to account for radium. In the United States, this meant, in the 1930s, companies making luminous paint-faced inspections, and the industry adopted voluntary precautions that limited some practices. Internationally, governments that controlled colonial mines adjusted the terms of concession contracts, and the movement of ore in ways dictated by economic and strategic factors as much as health concerned. The geopolitical importance of uranium in particular would make those strategic calculations urgent in the 1940s. The same ore that gave radium was now seen as a source of fissile material, and wartime secrecy changed the chain of custody in ways only understood later. Alongside these changes was an irony of dignity. The very success of radium as a medicine and technology, its allure, its marketability, had created the conditions of its social danger. When luminous technologies matured, and when governments and companies began to internalize the costs, the industry shrank in some ways, even as its importance grew in another. The uranium in pitchblende would become, in wartime, an object of national security, not consumer delight. And the story of the radium girls, the quiet, patient litigation and the slow work of pathologists, stood as a moral lesson. Markets that prize invisibility and novelty can leave people exposed unless law and science step in. What the litigation and later regulatory reflection did was not make hazard vanish instantly, but invent a new vocabulary for industrial responsibility. Companies were forced slowly to account for processes that once would have been excused as necessary accidents. Occupational health as a discipline, with its monitoring standards and protective technologies, grew in that difficult decades-long conversation. Investigators like Harrison Martland gave courts an empirical backbone. Reformers like Alice Hamilton, the industrial medicine pioneer, who had urged factories for years to take worker health seriously, provided public pressure and technical authority. Journalists to supply the civic ledger, turning blackboard calculations into human terms, and making it harder for companies to hide behind the myth. Yet the changes were imperfect. Settlements did not fully repair lives, nor did factory memos reverse the carcinogenic logic of exposure already taken. The environmental legacy was long-term. Contaminated sites needed decades of cleanup. Waste spread beyond company fences. The geopolitics of kept supply and demand turning beyond the immediate view of ethics. In the colonial mine, the workers who extracted concentrated ore remained as a rule far from the institutions that rewarded radium glow. In the north, indigenous communities saw industrial development arrive, with both jobs and long shadows. The state eventually took on responsibilities that had once been the private business of corporations. Later, cleanup programs, occupational disease registries, and public health campaigns would address the costs, but could not fully get back what had been lost. If you listen carefully to the timeline, you can hear a kind of tragic music that starts with wonder, moves through extraction and consumption, and ends with a changed public conscience. Radium's early promise to cure cancer, to light the night, to raise the prestige of labs and hospitals was not a lie. It gave real benefits. But that promise came with a set of costs. The modern industrial world had to learn to count. The luminous paint could not be separated from the mine. The therapy could not be removed from the freight charges and weight. The radium girls taught a lesson that would echo in later industrial fights about asbestos, benzene, lead, and many other invisible hazards, that science, law, and public attention must move together to constrain technologies that act on the body in ways not immediately seen. There is a bleak, almost comic aside here which history allows. The very symbol of modernity, the glow that made instruments readable in the dark, the element that was supposed to be a cure-all, became the agent that revealed limits to industrial benevolence. Companies that had once advertised radium as a fountain of youth paid out settlements. Chemists who had prized the element for research paid the price in moral caution. The glow that had been marketed as endless was in the end an arrow costly thing, whose getting needed long supply chains, political power and ethical thought. By the 1930s and into the 40s, the atom's more formidable secret, uranium-mess fissile potential, began to overshadow radium, a mess medical romance. Yet the institutional responses to radium, the labs that could measure microcuries, the public health agencies that would inspect factories, the legal ideas that let injured workers bring claims, were now part of the world's toolkit. The radium girls had forced a bargain. Technology would be tamed by oversight. It was an uneasy bargain, but it carried the scent of progress. The luminous dials would be made safer. Lip pointing would be forbidden in manuals. Ventilation ducts, masks and protocols would be written into the language of modern factories. So the arc completes itself in 3 movements. The hard geological start where mines and ore made a miracle possible. The intimate industrial middle where a glow changed ordinary objects and lives. And the legal scientific end where courts and committees taught industry to be accountable. The glow, once a promise, became also a teacher. From the pitch-blende shafts of Joachim's Vale, to the wind-scoured docks of Port Radium, to the factory benches of Ore Engine d'Ottawa, the radium economy wove a global pattern, whose threads work almost empire, labor and law. The memory of that pattern is a lesson about how rare things become valuable, how value erects hardship, and how societies learn painfully by litigation and public shame, and slow rule-making to make technology safer for those who do the smallest, most delicate work. The underground light that launched an era taught in its own terrible way the first rules of the Atomica.